The jungle of the Far East is an unforgiving landscape in which to fight a war. In 1944, it was an environment in which only the toughest and best trained could hope to survive against a Japanese enemy who had mastered the art of jungle warfare. In the jungles of Burma, an American commander proved the equal of the Japanese. He was Brigadier General Frank D. Merrill. His secretly recruited force was known as the 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional. In official dispatches, it was called by its operational codename Galahad. But the men he led became known to the world as Merrill's Marauders. The story of the Marauders was born out of a long series of humiliating defeats at the hands of the Japanese, which began in 1931. In the Chinese province of Manchuria, Japanese troops policed the railway which served Japan's mining interests. In September 1931, the Japanese faked an attempt to sabotage the railway. They blamed the Chinese. The Japanese army stationed in Korea then invaded Manchuria and seized its capital, Mukden. By the end of 1932, the Japanese had conquered the whole of Manchuria and parts of neighboring Mongolia. Japan's sole concession to international protest was to install the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, as puppet governor and later emperor of the supposedly new independent state of Manchu Kuo. The League of Nations sent a team to report on Manchuria.
We found that the Japanese occupation of this large part of China was not justified on the ground of self-defense, and that the new state which had been set up was a Japanese protectorate rather than a genuine case of Manchurian self-determination.
The League condemned Japan as an aggressor nation.
Son Excellence, Monsieur Matsuoka, délégué du Japon. I call on His Excellency, Monsieur Matsuoka, delegate of Japan. It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East.
Having defied the League of Nations, the Japanese delegates walked out, never to return. In January 1932, the Japanese fleet bombarded the port of Shanghai. A savage air attack was launched against the Chinese section of the city. There was heavy fighting between Japanese Marines and the Chinese 19th Route Army. Eventually, it took over 75,000 Japanese troops to capture Shanghai. Shifting their campaign to northern China, the Japanese conquered an area extending south to within 15 miles of Beijing. Rallying Chinese resistance was Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party. By early 1938, the Japanese controlled China's coastline and most of its major cities. Chiang was driven west to set up a new capital at Chongqing in the province of Sichuan. His only supply link with the outside world was now the Burma Road. This ran from Lashio to the Chinese city of Kunming. In December 1937, Japanese warplanes sank a US Navy gunboat, the Panay, in the Yangtze River. Prompt and profuse apologies from Tokyo diffused the crisis caused by the sinking of the Panay, but also alerted President Roosevelt to the growing threat posed by unchecked Japanese expansion. The Panay incident could not be forgotten. War between the United States and Japan became inevitable in 1941. when, in an attempt to halt further Japanese expansion, Roosevelt placed an embargo on oil exports to Japan. Apart from plentiful hydroelectric power, the Japanese had few natural resources of their own. And in the dry season, even the levels of hydroelectric power dipped dramatically. This lack of natural resources had been the driving force behind the war of conquest in China. The Japanese faced two alternatives: a humiliating withdrawal from the territories they had conquered, or the launching of a wider campaign of conquest to seize the industrial and agricultural resources of the Far East. Now that the Americans had turned off the oil tap, the Japanese economy would quickly grind to a halt. Would the Japanese choose peace or war? They chose war. By the spring of 1941, their plans for an Oriental blitzkrieg were well advanced. Their armies had been battle-hardened by the years of campaigning in China, and their effectiveness badly underestimated by Western military experts. The Japanese Navy also understood the importance of air power, but Japan's Emperor Hirohito had been warned by the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, that a war with the United States courted huge risks. Yamamoto knew the United States well and appreciated the almost limitless American industrial capacity which would be unlocked by war. Japan's ambitious war plans included an attack on the US Pacific Fleet's base at Pearl Harbor, the invasion of the Philippines, and the envelopment of the British and Dutch colonies. The Japanese Pacific Drive began with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's response was swift.
That since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
America now began to mobilize the manpower and the industrial might about which Admiral Yamamoto had warned his emperor. But the fight back was to begin in the shadow of strategic disaster in the Pacific and the Far East. The Japanese raced down the Malayan Peninsula towards the prize of Singapore. While the British kept to the main roads, the Japanese swarmed through the jungle, outflanking their enemy's main defense lines. The British fell back on Singapore. They evacuated their women and children. Those who stayed drank from the bitter cup of British surrender on the 15th of February, 1942. 130,000 troops laid down their arms. It was the greatest disaster in British military history. Burma's capital, Rangoon, came under air attack. The British forces in Burma were commanded by General Alexander. He was assisted by the American General Joseph Stilwell, commander of the Chinese 5th and 6th Armies, which had entered Burma to protect the Burma Road. Little love was lost between the British and the acerbic Stilwell, who was universally known as Vinegar Joe. While the crisis in Burma deepened, a gallant holding action was fought by the American Flying Tigers, a volunteer unit serving with the Chinese army. The Tigers' 3 squadrons of obsolescent P-40 fighters were to claim over 300 victories between December 1941 and July 1942. when they were absorbed into the US-China Air Task Force. But the Tigers could not stave off defeat in Burma. The Japanese rampage continued. On the 5th of March 1942, General Alexander decided to abandon Rangoon and withdraw overland to India. The longest retreat in British military history began on roads clogged with refugees fleeing the Japanese. The Japanese took Rangoon on the 8th of March and then pursued the retreating British all the way to the borders of India. Behind them, the British left a trail of blazing oil fields and wrecked plant. Hundreds of men were lost to malaria, dysentery, and tropical disease. Vinegar Joe Stilwell, accompanied by 18 American officers, made the retreat on foot. Stilwell's aide on the retreat was Major Frank D. Merrill, a genial, bespectacled officer in his late 30s, whose glasses perched on a peeling, sunburnt nose. In the 1930s, Merrill had served in Tokyo as a military attaché. He spoke Japanese and was well grounded in the methods of their army. On the 20th of May, Stilwell's party reached the hill station at Imphal on the Indian frontier. The monsoon had broken. 2 weeks earlier, the Japanese had taken the island fortress of Corregidor in the Philippines, the last bastion of American resistance in the Far East. Bombing and shelling had reduced the once lush island to a blackened, lunar landscape. The Japanese landed on Corregidor early on the 6th of May. They suffered heavy casualties from the American beach defenses, but rapidly gained a foothold on the island. The American commander of Corregidor, General Wainwright, decided to surrender. At a meeting later that day, the exhausted Wainwright, faced with the threat that the entire Corregidor garrison would be massacred, agreed to the surrender of all remaining American forces in the Philippines. The Americans had been humbled. The survivors of the battle for Corregidor went into a brutal captivity. Admiral Yamamoto had fulfilled the prophecy he had made of 6 months of Japanese victory. During those 6 months, the Japanese had carved out an empire which put even Adolf Hitler's European conquests to shame. In India, Merrill was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his work during the retreat from Burma. Stillwell was quoted as saying that the retreat had been as humiliating as hell. I think we should find what caused it, go back and retake Burma. But this was more easily said than done. Access to China was now only possible by way of airlift over the flanks of the Himalayas. The transports which landed at Chiang Kai-shek's headquarters in Kunming returned to Assam with a human cargo. These were Chinese troops flying to India to be trained for the reconquest of Burma. Camps had been established to house a new Chinese army, formed from the survivors of the fall of Burma and the fresh troops flown over the hump. Here they trained under the eagle eye of Vinegar Joe. But the country in which they were to fight presented a daunting prospect. War in the jungles of Burma was to be as much a battle against the jungle itself as the enemy. Wide and turbulent rivers presented formidable barriers. mountainous terrain was overlooked by the highest range in the world, the Himalayas. The land below had a climate of extremes, ranging from intense heat to the driving rain of the monsoon. The region's swamps were a breeding ground for malarial mosquitoes. Cholera, beriberi, typhus and dysentery were the common lot of jungle troops. This was the terrain in which the fight had to be carried back to the Japanese. By the beginning of 1943, the British had formed a long-range penetration force to fight in the jungle behind Japanese lines. Its bearded commander was Brigadier Ord Wingate, a genius to some, a misguided military eccentric to others. The men he led were known as Chindits, a corruption of Chintli, the stone lions which guarded the entrance to Burmese temples. In February 1943, the Chindits, officially the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, crossed the River Chindwin into Burma. Their mission was to attack Japanese outposts, cut railway lines and blow up bridges. The Chindit supplies were to be dropped from the air. Wingate calculated that this would be sufficient to sustain the 7 Chindit columns, each of about 500 men, operating deep in enemy-held country. At first, the Japanese were taken by surprise. But they recovered quickly and began to close in on the Chindit columns. As the Chindits pressed deeper into Burma, their lines of withdrawal came under increasing threat. On the 25th of March, Wingate ordered the columns to make their way independently back to Burma. The return march took over a month. The withdrawal turned into a nightmare. Many of the men were in a wretched physical state, racked by malaria and other tropical diseases. The wounded had to be left behind. At the end of April, the exhausted Chindits began to trickle back into India. Their material achievements had been slight. Some railway lines had been cut and several hundred Japanese killed. But in terms of morale, the effect of the first Chindit expedition was incalculable. They had destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle. 3 months later, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt met at the Trident Conference in Quebec. At Trident, the Allied Joint Chiefs of Staff accepted Wingate's proposals for large-scale Chindit operations in support of a renewed offensive in Burma. At the meeting was Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, soon to become Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. Mountbatten and the Joint Chiefs also agreed to raise a force of 3,000 Americans, secretly codenamed Galahad Force, to be trained in jungle warfare. After a passage of Allied infighting, General Stilwell wrested control of Galahad Force from Ord Wingate. The man he chose to command it was Frank D. Merrill, now a brigadier general. A veil of secrecy had been wrapped around Galahad Force. 3 weeks later, Galahad Force disembarked in the Indian port of Bombay, having picked up more volunteers in Australia and New Caledonia. It was not long before Mountbatten arrived to meet Merrill and inspect his men as they embarked on their training for jungle warfare. Chindits were drafted in to teach Merrill's men how to fight and survive in the jungle. The Americans were also introduced to the Gurkhas, the tribal fighting men of Nepal. Each Gurkha carried a small, sharp knife, the kukri. If he pulled the knife from its sheath, he had to draw blood from someone, even if he had to cut himself. The Gurkhas were rightly feared by the Japanese. Like the Chindits, the Americans were trained to use mules as pack animals. As one marauder later recalled, anyone who thinks a mule on land is difficult to handle should try launching one across a 100-yard-wide river. The marauders' pack personnel had their work cut out to learn how to get the best out of these stubborn animals, how to urge them on, and how to outsmart them. Also serving under Merrill were Nisei troops, Americans of Japanese descent. The Nisei were to play a vital role as interpreters and eavesdroppers on the enemy. Stilwell had now conceived a bold plan to re-establish land links with China by building a road to connect the Ledo railhead with Kunming. The so-called Ledo Road, aimed at solving China's acute problems of supply, would become something of an obsession with Stilwell. The road would have to struggle eastward against the grain of a landscape in which mountain ranges and rivers ran from north to south. Construction work on the Ledo Road began in December 1942. It was one of the most testing road-building jobs in history. By February 1943, work on the road had stalled at the Burma-India border, halted by lack of equipment and Japanese resistance. Stilwell also planned to lay an oil pipeline alongside the Ledo Road, with the aim of piping fuel from Calcutta to China. But like the Ledo Road, this ambitious undertaking could be completed only when the Japanese had been driven out of northern Burma. Work on the road and the pipeline was resumed in October 1943, but its completion depended on Allied success in the field. The plans were being laid. At a secret airfield in Assam, planes and gliders were being assembled for the 1st Air Commando Force. Its commanders were Colonel Philip Cochrane and Colonel John Allison, a former Flying Tiger. Cargo planes shuttled back and forth over the hump. The engineer units working on the Ledo Road were sustained by airdrops. The fighters and bombers of Eastern Air Command stepped up their attacks on Japanese strongholds. At the end of 1943, Mountbatten and his deputy Stilwell met to finalize plans for the clearing of northern Burma. In the coastal region of the Arakan, scene of an earlier unsuccessful British campaign against the Japanese, the British 14th Army was to go onto the offensive. In northeast Burma, the Chinese Ledo Force was to move on Myitkyina and Mogaung with the assistance of Merrill's command, soon to become known as the Marauders. The third element in the plan consisted of several Chindit operations in the enemy's rear, including airborne landings on sites cleared in the jungle. Finally, the Chinese Yunnan force was to strike from the east in a blow aimed at the vital Japanese transport hub at Myitkyina. It was a complex plan, requiring the coordination of very different forces in very difficult country against a most determined enemy. The first step was taken by 14th Army, closing on the towns of Maungdao and Buthidaung. But the Japanese launched a flank attack, codenamed Operation Z, which threatened to cut the Allied lines of communication through the Nachidauk Pass. There was a bitter fight for this vital neck of land. RAF bombers and fighters pounded Japanese positions. Meanwhile, British tanks clawed their way back into the Nachidauk, which the British had renamed the Okidoki Pass. The British troops in the air-supplied defensive box behind the pass were fighting for their lives, but they outnumbered the enemy, enjoyed air cover, and held firm. Japanese were broken by British firepower. The Okidoki Pass was reopened at the end of February. Victory was in sight in the Arakan. To the northeast, Galahad Force began its advance on the Japanese forces covering Myitkyina and Mogaon. Merrill's force was to operate in a harassing role on its left flank. Merrill's marauders had already had their baptism of fire. Early in 1944, Stilwell had employed them on the eastern flank of a Chinese offensive in the Hukaung Valley, on the distant approaches to Myitkyina. In the fighting which lay ahead, the marauders would find welcome allies in the Kachin tribesmen of northern Burma. The Kachin had suffered at the hands of the Japanese and were thirsting for revenge. These men of the hills were to prove superb guides and loyal allies to the marauders. On the 24th of February 1944, the marauders went to war. Their mission was to push south, down the Hukaung and Mogaon valleys. Ahead of the marauders lay 2 months of hard combat in extreme conditions. They were to march and fight through 500 miles of jungle, which would exact a heavy toll. Blocking the marauders' path was the experienced Japanese 18th Division, commanded by General Shinchi Tanaka. While the Chinese hammered away at the enemy front, the marauders thrust deep into the jungle in flanking actions behind the Japanese lines. The campaign saw the first pitched battles between American troops and the Japanese on the Asian mainland. In 2 major missions, the marauders had marched and fought through 500 miles of exceptionally harsh country. The marauders had come to terms with the jungle and had vindicated Wingate's tactics of air supply. The arrival of supplies was always a tense affair. Relief at the airdrop was tempered by the knowledge that food and ammunition had to be collected in an open space carved out of the jungle and perilously exposed to Japanese attack. Everything from blood plasma to 75mm howitzers and their ammunition had to be delivered by air. Without this, there could be no campaign in the jungle. The jungle itself was seldom neutral. Insect and leech bites could fester into ulcers which ate through a man's leg. The monster elephant leech, nearly a foot long, could work its way to the flesh through layers of clothing. The men who were flown out were the lucky ones. By the end of the marauders' second mission, their original strength of 3,000 men had been reduced by half. Morale had taken a terrible beating. But there was still time to snatch brief moments of rest and relaxation with the marauders' Kachin allies. Merrill had promised his men that they would be withdrawn after their second mission. But Vinegar Joe had a new task for the exhausted survivors of his command. Far from relieving them, Stilwell was now preparing to commit the marauders to reinforce the Chinese in the final drive to seize Myitkyina. There was only a short time left for impromptu dances with the friendly Kachin. It was now that Merrill's men became universally known as the Marauders, the name dreamed up by an American war correspondent. The supply planes droned overhead to deliver their weapons canisters. The Marauders viewed their third mission with foreboding. They had been given little time to rest and recuperate. Their ranks had been thinned by disease. For many Marauders, the drive on Myitkyina demanded more than they could now deliver. For Merrill, the advance on Myitkyina also threatened to be a mission too far. During the Marauders' second operation, he had suffered a heart attack, which had forced him to hand over operational control to Colonel Hunter. He was still recovering when the Marauders' third mission was launched at the end of April 1944. Merrill told the OSS men serving with him, his battalion commanders and the Chinese liaison officers, that a great prize awaited them at Myitkyina. The Marauders set off in 3 columns, codenamed H, K, and M. They had been trained in jungle warfare, but now they had orders to capture a major town. The march to Myitkyina began with a grueling trek over the 6,000-foot Kumon Range. The monsoon was also to break early. The march was exhausting to the men and their mules. No one knew from which quarter a Japanese counterattack might suddenly erupt from the jungle. It was a war of sudden actions against a hidden enemy. A Japanese outpost is detected ahead. The Marauders bring up a small field piece. Then the machine guns and mortars open up. The Marauders move in for the kill. Another Japanese nest has been wiped out. Many more awaited the Marauders on the march to Myitkyina. As a marauder dryly observed, the enemy seldom appear live on camera. The Japanese were no longer masters of the jungle they had conquered. They were now suffering in this pitiless war fought silently and at close quarters. They had met their match. This Japanese bullet had come close. This one, even closer. And this one, too close for comfort. The evacuation of the wounded in the jungle was back-breaking work. But the advance had to be maintained. Many of the Marauders were already close to breaking point. Isolated Japanese patrols attempted to escape by river. Few of them made it. Men and mules fought and slithered their way through the jungle. Both were exhausted. Their mules' fetlocks ran with blood from maggot-infested sores. By now, every marauder had lost at least 25 pounds in weight. Amoebic dysentery, scrub typhus, against which there was no immunizing agent, malaria, and combat fatigue were eating their way into Merrill's men. But they remained stoical. And their Japanese enemy was taking heavy casualties. Captors and captives were nearing the point of no return, which awaits all those who fight in the jungle. But the long march to Myitkyina was nearly over. In mid-May, the men of H Force sighted their objective. Below them, the target, with its vital airfield, had already been reconnoitered by the Kachin guides and OSS men. The Japanese had been taken by surprise. Colonel Hunter decided to attack on the 17th of May, but first, airstrikes were called in. On cue, the fighter bombers of 10th Air Force arrived overhead. The few Japanese fighters which managed to scramble from the airstrip were swiftly shot down. Hard-won Allied air superiority proved vital. The Japanese no longer controlled the jungle or the skies above. As 10th Air Force delivered its last bombs, it was time for the marauders to move in. As soon as Colonel Hunter considered his hold on the airstrip secure, he sent the prearranged code signal, Merchant of Venice, to bring in glider-borne reinforcements. It had been feared that the Japanese might attempt to put the airfield out of action, so aviation engineers had been placed on standby. But Hunter had radioed that the strip was in good condition. Hunter needed a quick injection of infantry and supplies so that he could move on Myitkyina before the Japanese could rush in their own reinforcements. But when the gliders came in, they contained anti-aircraft units. What seemed like a sensible precaution at the headquarters of the India-Burma Army Air Force was to result in a prolonged and bloody struggle for Myitkyina. Nevertheless, the seizure of the airstrip created a sensation within the Allied High Command. The Anglophobe Stilwell had done his best to conceal his intention of taking Myitkyina from his theatre commander, Mountbatten. As the Americans consolidated their hold on the airstrip, a first-class row was brewing within the Allied High Command. Meanwhile, Wingate's Chindits were on the move. Colonel Phil Cochrane's No. 1 Air Commando was to fly the Chindits 77th Brigade into a cleared strip of jungle, codenamed Broadway, deep behind enemy lines. Each of Cochrane's Dakotas towed 2 gliders. The men they carried were to have a bumpy landing at Broadway. There were many killed and seriously injured. Immediately, engineers set to work, leveling Broadway to receive transports and fighters. Spitfires and Tomahawks flew in. The transports brought artillery to beat back successive Japanese counterattacks. While air battles raged over Broadway, the Chindits established 2 more jungle strongholds. One of them, codenamed White City, lay astride the railway to Myitkyina. Frenzied Japanese counterattacks against these British strongholds were beaten back with heavy losses. The Chindits were plentifully supplied and defended from the air. But on the evening of the 24th of March, the Chindits lost their inspirational commander when the aircraft in which he'd been visiting the front line crashed into a mountain ridge. The Chindit base at Broadway remained as a vindication of Wingate's theories of jungle warfare. Now the Japanese initiated a long-planned offensive. On India's northeast frontier, 2 divisions drove on the hill station at Imphal. "70 miles to the north, a 3rd enemy division marched on Kohima. To meet the Japanese offensive, reinforcements were transferred from the Arakan front. Once again, Allied airlift capacity was to prove vital. At Kohima, the British and Indian garrison clung on by their fingertips. At the end of April, with the monsoon looming, the Chindits abandoned White City and Broadway. Many were evacuated, and those who remained were moved north and placed under the command of Vinegar Joe Stilwell. There was no respite for these men. They were ordered to take the heavily defended town of Mogaung to the west of Myitkyina. The battle for Mogaung lasted 16 days. When the town fell, Stilwell's headquarters gave the credit to Chinese troops. The Chindit commander, Colonel Mad Mike Calvert, signaled Stilwell, "The Chinese having taken Mogaung, the 77th Brigade is proceeding to take umbrage." Stilwell was to prove just as ruthless with the marauders at Michinar. The failure fully to exploit the early capture of the airfield led to a siege of the town as the Japanese funneled in reinforcements. The marauders were at the end of their tether. They had been promised that they would fight in Burma for only 3 months. But 6 months had now passed, and there seemed no end to the fighting. The Chinese had brought in more artillery, but the Japanese defended Michinar as stubbornly as the British and Indians had defended Kohima and Imphal. Casualties mounted. Eight out of every 10 marauders were stricken with dysentery. Up to 100 sick men were being airlifted out every day. Men were falling asleep at their posts. Their commander, Frank D. Merrill, had succumbed to another heart attack. On the 25th of May, Colonel Hunter had accused Stilwell of abusing and neglecting his men, who were now all but finished as a fighting force. Hunter urged Stilwell to disband the marauders. Unwilling to make an exception of the marauders, Stilwell ordered the rear area hospitals to be combed for replacements. Convalescents were sent back to the front in the face of protests from the doctors treating them. But Stilwell would not relieve the marauders. The marauders were mired in the mud of Michinar until it was taken at the beginning of August 1944. When the town fell, only about 200 of them remained in the area. A month earlier, Mountbatten had clashed with Stilwell over the harsh demands his subordinate had made on the exhausted Chindits. But Mountbatten could not save the marauders. Yet both forces of hardened jungle fighters had played their part in turning the tide against the Japanese in the spring of 1944. At Kohima and Imphal, the British had held the Japanese and then hurled them back into the jungle. The humiliation heaped on their shoulders during the loss of Malaya and Burma had been avenged. These victories, taken alongside the savage battle for Michinar, broke the back of the Japanese army in Burma. They set the Allies on the road to victory. But much hard fighting lay ahead before the Japanese laid down their arms in August 1945. Merrill's marauders were to end the war in China as the Mars Task Force. In a modern, mechanized war, they had marched and fought on foot in some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world. In the jungle and at Michinar, they had given their all. Colonel Hunter called them the most beat upon, most mishandled, most heroic, and most unrewarded regimental-sized unit in World War II. In contrast to the soldiers who lusted for glory, their commander, Frank D. Merrill, emerges as one of the most attractive military heroes of World War II. His men weren't saints, but they were the marauders.